Aegon the Conqueror. Before there were 7 kingdoms, there were 7 separate realms, each ruled by its own king, each convinced it could stand alone forever. Aegon Targaryen changed that in the span of a single lifetime. He came from Dragonstone, a bleak island fortress off the eastern coast, the last outpost of a dead empire. His family had once belonged to Valyria, a civilization of dragonlords that ruled half the known world through fire and blood, until Valyria was destroyed in a single catastrophe, a cataclysm called the Doom that swallowed an entire continent in volcanic ruin. The Targaryens survived only because they had left 12 years before it burned. They were the last dragonlords in the world, sitting on a rock in the sea, far from the lands that would one day be their empire. Aegon had 2 sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, and he married both of them, which was the Valyrian custom. This is worth understanding early, because it explains almost everything about the family that follows. The Targaryens married brother to sister generation after generation, partly to keep their bloodline pure, and partly because they believed they were closer to gods than to ordinary men. This belief made them magnificent. It also, eventually, drove several of them insane. When Aegon launched his conquest, he did not have an army large enough to take a continent. What he had were 3 dragons. Balerion, called the Black Dread, was the largest dragon that ever lived, so enormous he could swallow a horse whole, and his shadow could darken an entire town. Vhagar and Meraxes were his sister's mounts, smaller only by comparison, still capable of melting stone and roasting armies where they stood. With these 3 creatures, Aegon burned his enemies out of the sky. Only one kingdom was never truly conquered. Dorne, in the far south, refused to meet Aegon in open battle. The Dornish melted into their deserts and mountains, struck from ambush, and simply endured. Aegon burned their castles again and again, and each time they rebuilt and returned. It was during this long, grinding failure that Rhaenys and her dragon Meraxes were killed, brought down by a single arrow through the eye. Dorne would not join the realm for another 2 centuries, and not through conquest at all. Aegon forged his throne from the swords of his defeated enemies. 1,000 blades melted together by dragon flame into a jagged, uncomfortable seat. He called it the Iron Throne, and he made it deliberately unpleasant to sit upon, because a king should never sit easy. He built a new capital and called it King's Landing. By the time he died, 6 of the 7 kingdoms answered to a single crown, and the realm he had assembled from 7 separate ones had never existed before he made it. Maegor the Cruel. Aegon's second son took the throne, and he earned his terrible name honestly. Where Aegon had been a builder, Maegor was a destroyer, a man of enormous physical strength and even greater rage, and he wore the crown for 6 years that felt to the realm like standing too close to an open fire. He was a warrior above all else, perhaps the most dangerous swordsman his family ever produced, and he solved nearly every problem the same way. He killed it. His reign was defined by 2 long, bloody conflicts. The first was with the Faith of the Seven, the dominant religion of Westeros, which had never accepted the Targaryen practice of incest and had raised armies of fanatical warriors against it. Maegor met them with dragonfire and slaughter, on a scale that shocked even his own supporters. He once invited a great gathering of the faithful to negotiate peace and then had them massacred where they stood. The faith would remember this, and the memory would poison the relationship between crown and religion for generations. His second conflict was with his own family. Maegor had no living children, and every nephew who might one day threaten his seat became a target. He killed relatives. He killed rivals. He killed men whose only crime was standing in a line of succession that inconvenienced him. He married multiple women in search of an heir, and when they miscarried monstrous stillbirths again and again, some whispered that the gods themselves were cursing his union. Maegor also raised the great castle that would dominate King's Landing forever after. He built the Red Keep, and within it a fortress called Maegor's Holdfast, and it is said that when the work was finished, he executed every worker and architect who had labored on it, so no one alive would know its secret passages and traps. Even his architecture was built on murdered bodies. In the end, the realm simply turned against him. His cruelty had cost him every ally, and even his own mother, it was said, came to see him as a monster. One morning he was found dead upon the Iron Throne itself, seated on the jagged blades with his own veins opened, though whether by his hand or another's was never proven. He had ruled 6 years and left no children, and the crown passed to his young nephew Jaehaerys, who had already risen in revolt against him. Jaehaerys the Conciliator. Jaehaerys took the throne as a boy of 14 and held it for 55 years, the longest reign in Targaryen history, and he used that half-century not to conquer or to burn, but to heal. His name in the histories is the Conciliator, the peacemaker, the one who reconciled. He inherited a broken, frightened realm from his uncle Maegor and spent his entire life mending it, patiently, deliberately, one wound at a time. His first great achievement was ending the war with the Faith. Where Maegor had used fire, Jaehaerys used diplomacy. He negotiated a lasting peace, granting the Faith protections and forgiveness in exchange for their acceptance of Targaryen rule and Targaryen marriage customs. The armies of fanatics were disbanded. The crown and the religion, which had been at each other's throats for decades, finally learned to coexist. It was the kind of victory that produces no songs, because nobody died gloriously for it, and it was more valuable than any battle his ancestors ever won. Jaehaerys ruled alongside his sister wife Alysanne, and their partnership was one of the genuinely happy things in the whole grim history of the family. Alysanne toured the realm, listened to small folk and noble women, and pushed her husband toward reforms he might never have considered alone. Under their joint reign, the roads were rebuilt, laws were codified across the kingdoms, and old cruelties were outlawed. The realm grew prosperous, and the population swelled. For the first time since the conquest, ordinary people could live without expecting a dragon on the horizon. But even this golden age carried the family's particular curse. Jaehaerys and Alysanne had many children, and their family life was riddled with tragedy and bitter estrangement. Sons and daughters died young. Some rebelled. And most consequentially, the question of who would succeed him became a slow-building crisis, because the natural heirs kept dying before their father. By the end of his long life, Jaehaerys had outlived nearly everyone who should have followed him, and the succession he was forced to arrange would eventually tear the dynasty apart. His final act as king was to name a successor from among his grandchildren and call a great council of lords to ratify the choice. The lords chose the male line over the female. A grandson, Viserys, was crowned in preference to a granddaughter who arguably had the stronger claim. Viserys I. Viserys inherited the half-century of peace that Jaehaerys had built, and by temperament he was an ideal man to enjoy it, and a disastrous man to protect it. He was kind, generous, warm, and desperate above all things to be loved and to keep his family at peace. In a stable era, these might have been great virtues. In the era he actually lived in, they were the qualities that allowed a catastrophe to grow, unchecked, in his own home, while he refused to see it. Viserys presided over the absolute peak of Targaryen power. The realm had never been richer, the dynasty had never had more dragons, and the court gleamed with a prosperity that seemed like it could last forever. He was not a bad king in any active sense. He built, he celebrated, he kept the peace his grandfather had left him. But he was a man who could not bear conflict, and so whenever a hard decision loomed, he delayed it, softened it, or simply looked away, and every one of those avoidances accumulated into a debt that would come due in blood the moment he was gone. His central failure was the succession, and it was a failure of clarity. Viserys named his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir and made his lords swear oaths to support her. This was extraordinary, because no woman had ever ruled the Seven Kingdoms in her own right. But then Viserys remarried and had sons with his new wife, and he never resolved the obvious contradiction that followed. He continued to insist Rhaenyra was his heir, while also elevating the sons who now stood as her rivals. He wanted everyone to be happy. He wanted no one to be disappointed. And so he left two claims standing side by side, each believing itself the true one. The court split into two factions around this ambiguity, hardening over years into open hatred. On one side stood Rhaenyra and those loyal to her father's stated wishes. On the other stood the queen, her children, and the powerful lords who saw a chance for advancement in a male heir. Viserys watched this division grow at his own dinner table, and he responded by pretending it wasn't happening, hosting feasts, and insisting on the appearance of family unity, while the reality curdled beneath it. When Viserys finally died, an old and mostly contented man, he believed he was leaving behind a settled succession. Instead, he left two heirs, two factions, and a realm full of dragons, all of it balanced on a lie of unity he had spent his whole reign maintaining. Within days, the pretense collapsed, Aegon II. When Viserys died, a small circle of the queen's allies moved fast, before the news could even spread. They crowned Viserys' eldest son, a young man who had spent his life as a prince with no expectation of ruling, and presented the realm with a done deed. Aegon II was king, they declared, because the natural order placed a son above a daughter. Whether Aegon himself truly wanted the throne is genuinely unclear. He was pushed onto it by ambitious relatives who needed a king, and he happened to be the one available. Aegon was not a natural ruler. He was pleasure-loving, resentful, and prone to bitterness, a man who had spent his life in the shadow of a sister he despised, and now found himself the figurehead of a cause that used him as much as it served him. But he had one enormous asset, the same that mattered most in every Targaryen conflict. He had a dragon, and his siblings had dragons. The war that followed was not a war of armies alone. It was a war of these creatures, turned for the first time against one another, and the results were more horrifying than anything the family had ever inflicted on its enemies. The Dance of the Dragons destroyed the thing that had made the Targaryens invincible. For a century, the dynasty's power had rested on the fact that no one else in the world had dragons. Now, the dragons fought each other in the skies over Westeros, and they died. Great beasts that had reigned for decades were torn apart in single afternoons. Riders burned. The mystique of Targaryen supremacy, the idea that they were untouchable gods riding untouchable monsters, bled out over this single conflict, because the whole world watched the monsters slaughter one another. His reign ended the way most Targaryen reigns in this period did. He was poisoned, most likely by his own people, who had concluded the war would never end while he lived. By the time he died, the dragons were nearly all gone, the treasury was ruined, and the family that had once burned a continent into submission was a shadow of itself. Aegon III. Aegon III. The boy who inherited the wreckage was one of the most tragic figures the family ever produced, and his tragedy was of a very particular kind. He was not cruel, and he was not mad. He was traumatized. As a child, Aegon III had watched his own mother be devoured by a dragon, torn apart and eaten before his eyes, and that single image defined the rest of his life. He grew into a somber, withdrawn, joyless king, a man who seemed permanently haunted, ruling a realm out of duty rather than any desire, and who was known ever after by a name that captured his entire character. They called him the Dragonbane. That name is the key to understanding him. Aegon III hated dragons. He had every reason to. The creatures that had made his family great had also killed his mother, burned his childhood, and destroyed everyone he loved in a war fought over which of them would sit a chair. And so during his reign, the last dragons of House Targaryen dwindled and died, and there were persistent rumors, never proven, that the king himself had a hand in their extinction, that he quietly allowed or even arranged for the final beasts to perish. Whether it was murder or merely neglect born of hatred, the outcome was the same. The dragons went extinct on his watch. Aegon's own reign was as gray as his temperament. He rebuilt the treasury the Dance had emptied and restored some stability to a broken realm. He was, by the dull standards of administration, a reasonably competent king, but there was no joy in any of it, no warmth, no light. He rarely smiled. He rarely left his rooms. He raised children who barely knew him and ruled a court that found him impossible to love. Baelor the Blessed. Baelor was a grandson of Aegon III, and he was fanatically, overwhelmingly religious, a man who devoted himself to the faith of the Seven with a totality that consumed his entire reign. His people, who found his gentleness a welcome relief after so much fire and madness, loved him for it and called him the Blessed. His actual record as a ruler is far stranger and more troubling than the name suggests, a mix of genuine holiness and something close to mania. Baelor's devotion expressed itself in acts of genuine mercy and alarming instability, sometimes at once. He made peace with Dorne, the kingdom the family had never conquered, and did it by walking there himself, barefoot as a pilgrim, an act of humility so extreme it disarmed his enemies. He built a great sept that would stand at the heart of King's Landing for centuries. He fed the poor. He tried to rule as a holy man rather than a warlord. In an age of cruelty, there was something almost miraculous about a king who genuinely wanted to be good. But his piety was also a kind of illness. Baelor took his convictions to lengths that damaged the realm and the family. He was so committed to chastity that he refused to consummate his marriage to his own sister wife, and eventually imprisoned her and their sisters in a tower to keep himself from the temptation of women entirely, locking away his female relatives as if they were the danger. He fasted so severely, so often, that he repeatedly starved himself into delirium and collapse. He burned books he considered sinful. His goodness and his mania were not separate things. They were the same impulse, pointed in different directions. Baelor's severe fasting finally killed him. He died young, wasted away by his own devotion, Aegon the Unworthy. When Baelor died, the throne passed briefly to his uncle Viserys II, and then to Viserys' son, Aegon IV, the king the histories remember as the Unworthy. Every part of his reign earned the name. He was gluttonous, cruel, lecherous, and vain, a man who indulged every appetite without limit, and governed with no thought beyond his own pleasure and his own resentments. He was arguably the worst ruler the dynasty ever produced who was not actively insane, and the damage he did came not from fire or madness, but from pettiness and lust. Aegon the Unworthy's excesses became legendary and ruinous. He grew so enormously fat he could barely move by the end of his life, his body a monument to appetite. He took countless mistresses and openly humiliated his own wife, discarding lovers and elevating new ones on nothing but whim. He was said to have bedded a mistress from nearly every noble house in the realm, and this was not merely gossip. It had consequences, because the children of those affairs, his acknowledged bastards, became a poison injected directly into the bloodline of the realm. His single most catastrophic act came on his deathbed. Aegon the Unworthy, in a final gesture of spite or sentimentality, legitimized all of his bastard children at once, giving them the family name and, with it, plausible claims to the throne they never should have had. In one stroke, he transformed a collection of illegitimate sons into a set of rival claimants, each now noble, each now dangerous, and set them loose upon a realm that already had a legitimate heir. The most prominent of them, Daemon Blackfyre, would grow into a threat that haunted the dynasty for generations. The consequence of that deathbed decision was a series of rebellions that plagued the family for decades, known as the Blackfyre Rebellions. Daemon Blackfyre raised army after army in pursuit of the throne, insisting his blood was as good as any true-born king's, and each uprising had to be crushed at enormous cost in lives and treasure. Aegon the Unlikely. Aegon V was called the Unlikely because he was a fifth son, far down any reasonable line of succession, a prince who had spent his youth in obscurity and reached the throne only because everyone ahead of him had died. He became one of the most quietly admirable rulers the family ever produced, and the reason lay in that obscurity. He had learned to see the realm from the bottom up. As a young man, this prince had traveled the kingdoms in disguise, living among the small folk, serving as a common squire to a hedge knight, sleeping in ditches and seeing firsthand how the powerful abused the weak. No Targaryen before him had ever known the realm this way, from the perspective of the people who suffered under its lords, rather than those who ruled them. And this shaped him into something rare among his family. He became a king who genuinely wanted to help the common people, who saw the nobility's cruelty clearly because he had felt it, and who spent his reign trying to protect the powerless from the powerful. Aegon the Unlikely pushed for reforms that improved the lives of the small folk, and, in doing so, made bitter enemies of the great lords who profited from the old order. He tried to grant the common people rights and protections they had never had, and to check a nobility that had gone unchallenged for centuries. These were decent goals, and they cost him constantly, because the lords resented every concession forced from them and resisted him at every turn. He was a king fighting his own aristocracy on behalf of people who could not fight for themselves. But he carried the family's oldest shadow too, a belief that his bloodline was destined for something greater, and a growing conviction that the Targaryens needed a dragon again to fulfill it. Aegon the Unlikely died trying to bring dragons back into the world. In a great hall, surrounded by his family and closest friends, he attempted some ritual meant to hatch dragon eggs through blood and fire and prophecy. Aerys, the Mad King. Aerys II is remembered by a single damning title, the Mad King. He began as a promising young king and descended over the course of his reign into paranoid, sadistic insanity, and by the end, he was a genuine danger to every living soul in his kingdom. His overthrow is the event the entire saga of Westeros is built upon, and unlike some of the family's other troubled rulers, there is no reinterpretation that softens him. Aerys did not start out mad. In his early years, he was ambitious, generous, and full of grand plans, a king who seemed like he might do great things. But something in him broke, slowly and then completely. The Targaryen curse, the centuries of brother marrying sister, the concentration of an unstable bloodline into an ever narrower channel, finally produced in Aerys a mind that came apart. He grew paranoid, convinced. Everyone around him was plotting his death, and cruel, taking pleasure in the suffering of the men he executed. And he developed a specific, terrible obsession that defined his final years. He fell in love with fire. Aerys became fixated on burning people alive. He came to believe fire was pure, that it cleansed, and he had men burned before him for the smallest offenses or none at all, watching them die with a pleasure that horrified even his own court. He surrounded himself with wildfire, a green alchemical flame that burned hotter than any natural fire and could not easily be extinguished, and he had enormous caches of it hidden throughout his capital. His obsession grew until it consumed his judgment entirely. The king who loved fire began to dream of using it on a scale that would make his ancestors' conquests look merciful. His paranoia and cruelty eventually triggered the rebellion that ended his dynasty. Aerys demanded the deaths of great lords who had done nothing to deserve them, burning some alive in his throne room in scenes of pure horror, executing a father in front of his son for his own amusement. These atrocities drove the powerful families of the realm into open revolt, and the war that followed broke the back of Targaryen rule. As his enemies closed in on his capital, Aerys gave the order to ignite the wildfire hidden beneath the city, to burn King's Landing and every soul in it to ash, choosing to murder his entire capital rather than surrender it. He was killed before that final order could take effect, cut down by one of his own sworn protectors, a knight who chose to break the most sacred oath he had ever taken rather than let 500,000 people burn. Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra was named heir to the Iron Throne by her own father, Viserys, publicly, with the oaths of his lords to bind it, and she was denied the crown anyway, because she was a woman, and because her half-brother's supporters moved faster than her own. She was, by her father's clear and stated will, the rightful ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, and whether she counts as a true queen has been argued ever since. She was never simply handed the throne. She had to fight for it, and the fight consumed her. When her father died and her half-brother was crowned in her place, Rhaenyra did not surrender her claim. She raised her own banners, crowned herself in answer, and plunged the realm into the civil war remembered as the Dance of the Dragons. She had dragons and dragon riders among her sons and supporters, and for a time the war swung in her favor. She even took King's Landing and sat the Iron Throne itself, the throne her father had promised her. But the seat she had fought her whole life to claim brought her no security at all. Her reign in the capital was brief and disastrous. The war had already grown vicious beyond recovery, dragons killing dragons, sons dying on both sides, and the losses hardened Rhaenyra into someone harsher and more suspicious than she had been. The people of King's Landing turned against her. Her allies fell away. Her enemies regrouped, and the throne that had been the object of her entire existence became a trap, holding her in a capital that no longer wanted her while her cause collapsed around her. Rhaenyra's end was as cruel as anything in the family's history. Jon Snow. Jon Snow was a Targaryen who never knew he was one, a man raised under a false name in the cold north, believing himself the bastard son of a lord when he was, in truth, the hidden heir to the throne his family had lost. His entire life was built on a secret kept to protect him. His mother was a Targaryen princess, sister to the exiled, children of the Mad King. His father was a northern lord who had loved her and hidden her child away, claiming the boy as his own bastard, rather than reveal a truth that would have gotten the infant killed. Jon grew up knowing none of this. He was raised as the shameful secret of an honorable man, treated as lesser in his own home, and he responded to that lifelong exclusion by seeking a place where his birth would not define him. He joined the ancient order that guarded the far northern wall, where he became a leader through sheer merit, earning the respect his blood had denied him. He knew nothing of thrones or dynasties. He fought the actual, existential threat the squabbling kings of the South had ignored, the enemy that did not care who sat the Iron Throne. When the truth of his birth finally came out, it emerged that his parents had married in secret, making him not a bastard at all, but the true-born son of a Targaryen princess, with a stronger claim to the Iron Throne than anyone alive, including the last Targaryen queen he had come to serve and love. But Jon never wanted the throne, and this is what separates him from nearly every Targaryen before him. He had watched the pursuit of that seat drive people to atrocity his entire life. He had seen what fire and ambition did to those who chased power, and he wanted no part of it. He wanted only to protect people and serve something larger than himself, and the crown was never among his desires. When the last Targaryen queen, the woman he loved, finally seized King's Landing, she did to it what the Mad King had only dreamed of doing. She burned the city and its people alive, thousands of them, from the back of her dragon, And in that moment, Jon saw the whole terrible history of his family arrive at its inevitable conclusion. Faced with a ruler consumed by fire, and certain she would burn the world to build her vision of it, Jon chose to end it, killing the queen he loved to stop her, and choosing the lives of countless strangers over his own blood. He did not take the throne that was rightfully his. He walked away from it entirely, exiled once more to the cold north he had come from. He was the last known member of House Targaryen, and the throne passed instead to an elected king, ending 3 centuries of dragon rule that had begun with Aegon the Conqueror.